The year is 1997. Manhattan has been turned into a prison. Inside lies the captured President of the United States, and only one man can get him out: America's most wanted criminal. In 1981, John Carpenter made one of the defining films of his career, Escape from New York. Part thriller, part sci-fi dystopia, and powered by a satirical edge pointed at the US government and the country's rising crime rates. It's a movie that defied its limited budget thanks to its resonating dark ideas and hardened world that feels just a step or two removed from ours. And I think it's the combination of its rough-edged sci-fi future and how perfectly Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken fits into it that's allowed Escape from New York to really grow in the minds of audiences and create a huge reputation as a cool but grim vision of a future America. From its budgetary limitations that forced Carpenter and company to get creative, to its political commentary on America in the 70s and 80s, through the many different homages that have kept the spirit of this film alive in both official and unofficial representations, there's so many reasons why I keep coming back to Escape from New York again and again, and I know I'm not alone. This is Escape from New York, John Carpenter's American Nightmare.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Escape from New York may have premiered on July 10, 1981, but the first draft of the film was written in 1974, right when Richard Nixon was resigning as President of the United States at the height of the Watergate scandal. It's a massive crisis of conscience surrounding crime in the presidency, and alongside the US pulling out of the Vietnam War after more than a decade of disaster, you can immediately see the erosion of American patriotism sparking a story like Escape. At the same time, Carpenter was finishing his first feature film, Dark Star, which started as a student film at USC that was financed to become feature-length. And over the next 6 years, Carpenter's career exploded with the massive success of Halloween in 1978, mixing with several hit TV movies like Elvis and Someone's Watching Me, and low-budget successes like Assault on Precinct 13 and The Fog. All the while, Carpenter's original draft of Escape sat in his car until Avco Embassy Pictures, which had made The Fog, asked for Carpenter to make them another movie. Afterward, Carpenter brought on friend Nick Castle, who of course played Michael Myers in Halloween, but has also gone on to be an accomplished screenwriter and director, to polish up the script and add some levity. And alongside cinematographer Dean Cundy, producers Larry Franco and Deborah Hill, production designer Joe Alves, editor Todd Ramsey, co-film scorer Alan Howarth, and a budget of $5 million, the film was shot from August through November of 1980, almost entirely at night. When watching Escape, you can see where the budget is limited, but one of the things that made Carpenter such a successful director for a lot of his career was his ability to write scripts with a budget in mind, always knowing how much a section of the film would cost, and making sure to create a story that would accommodate what money he knew he was going to have. Despite being set in New York, only 2 days of the shoot were actually filmed in the Big Apple, mostly around the Statue of Liberty, here used by a fascistic government as a prison processing center where it once welcomed immigrants, with the rest using backlots and basins in Los Angeles and downtown St. Louis, Missouri, which had been gutted by a massive fire in 1977, for the destroyed streets. Touches like the plane crash only seen as an animated simulation, or Snake's skyline grid, in actuality a model of the city made out of cardboard boxes painted black and covered with green lines, are because there was no money for the real deal. But it's done so stylishly that it gives the film a real identity. The same goes for its patient camera work and deep focus. Like Halloween, a lot of Escape was shot using Panaglide cameras, which didn't need tracks and could smoothly follow an actor by walking with them. And longer takes meant fewer setups, meant less time and money needed to shoot the film. Cundy also used Panavision lenses developed in 1980 that were able to shoot in low light, and with a big depth of field that didn't require a lot of lighting. So all those real, burnt-out city streets could be seen with minimal lighting setups. Once again, needing less time and money, but looking fantastic. The result is a really darkly lit film, but one that feels much more real despite limited money for sets. To build out backgrounds, the film uses a lot of matte paintings, and one, during the helicopter drop, is actually by a young James Cameron. One of the great pleasures I have in watching a film with a small budget made by masters of the craft is that it becomes very obvious where their skills and inventiveness come into play to make the film possible. It itself is one of the great joys in watching Escape from New York, even though it is pretty flawed in a lot of different ways. Anyway, on to the story. Escape from New York begins in the far-flung future of 1997, with rising crime rates and the US government's turn toward totalitarian control, resulting in the entire island of Manhattan turned into a prison. Convicted of a crime, get thrown into New York, which is now fully surrounded by a massive and heavily guarded wall. Inside, the criminals are left to their own devices. But just as infamous criminal and war veteran Snake Plissken is about to be sent into New York, Air Force One is hijacked by terrorists, who crash the plane into the island, with the president surviving in an escape pod. Snake is given one choice: get in and get the president out in 24 hours and be set free, or be locked in New York forever. Making matters more complicated is that the president is scheduled to present nuclear fusion findings that could create new allies with world leaders, that crime boss the Duke has captured the president and plans to use him to leave the island, and that Snake has been implanted with a timed capsule bomb that will kill him in 24 hours if he's not out with the president in time. It's a simple premise, but one that makes several big leaps to establish its world. The decision to turn Manhattan into a prison island of all places is silly, but it's also reflective of New York's reputation at the time. Violent crimes in New York absolutely exploded in the 1970s, averaging more than 150,000 violent crimes a year, more than 2,000 murders a year, more than 5,000 rape incidents per year, and hundreds of thousands of thefts and assaults happening annually, with the numbers staying up throughout the 80s. Rising crime, an untrustworthy government, and the recent Iran hostage crisis begged the question, what will happen to the United States? When people talk about the so-called Carpenter style, I think they're thinking of a few specific films: Halloween, The Thing, Assault on Precinct 13, The Fog, and Escape from New York. Carpenter, especially when working alongside cinematographer Dean Cundey, as he does in Escape, creates long, patient shots that make the most of anamorphic widescreen lenses. His approach to horror or tension is patient, and lets the atmosphere settle in instead of relying on jump scares or grotesque effects. The plots are straightforward and focused, with the themes and commentary playing out in character choices instead of big pieces of dialogue. A lot of this is the byproduct of shooting many of his most famous movies on a very limited budget. Here in Escape, that means the film can't fully explore its concepts in the way I think it should. The power structure of New York, the relationships between its characters, a larger arc for Snake, and a greater conflict could all be explored more if the film had just a little bit more money. But what we do get is done with such style and control that it still really works. And of course, special mention has to be made of Carpenter and Howarth's score. Like the rest of his films, it's almost entirely composed of synth, and I think it's marvelous. The main theme has a lovely blend of Western showdown and sci-fi tension, while Engulfed Cathedral interprets Claude Debussy for a soaring nightscape, and The Duke Arrives is appropriately funky for Isaac Hayes' cool but intimidating crime lord. Stylistically and tonally, I think what may throw off a lot of people when first watching Escape, especially today, is that the premise and reputation of the film feels much more like an action movie than it really is. Sure, there's some shootouts and fights, and Carpenter directs them really well, but this is much more of a suspense picture than an action movie. Unsurprisingly, there's some real moments of horror throughout that really add to the terror of the situation Plissken finds himself in. Manhattan is essentially hell on earth, filled with the most dangerous people alive that have resorted to any means necessary to survive. The early scene with the Underdwellers attack is especially horrifying, bringing life to a group that lurks in the sewers and tunnels, waiting to pull down their next meal. But Carpenter really changes up the tone of his film from scene to scene, and there's a level of humor throughout that underlines the satire of the whole thing. If there's any movie that I think is a true kindred spirit to Escape, it's Walter Hill's The Warriors from 1979. I love this scumbum odyssey, taking place in an exaggerated then modern New York, where there are not only hundreds of gangs running roughshod over the Big Apple, but also heavily themed in attire and gimmick. The Warriors is using its premise of one gang framed for a murder and trying to get back home to tell an adventure story. And like that film, Escape's future dystopian New York is just close enough to reality to be easy to buy into, but heightened enough to have fun with. Beyond its world of crime gone mad and government power run rampant, what really made people love Escape from New York for years was Snake Plissken. The thing about Snake is that he's a very simply drawn character whose legend and attitude make him much bigger than a single story. Whenever anyone meets him, they have one thing to say.
I thought you were dead.
Yeah, but I heard you were dead.
Heard you were dead.
I heard you were dead.
Snake, I swear to God, I thought you were dead. Yeah, you and everybody else.
Everyone knows Snake. He's a legend in the underworld and a boogeyman to the government. I made everyone corrupt in this world, said Carpenter. And Snake Plissken is the only man with honor because he doesn't care about anybody. Snake is a great character because I believe in him. I think he's one of those what-if characters. What if you could be Snake Plissken? You'd love to kick ass like that. You'd love to just not have a care, other than for yourself, in the world. In the larger context of Carpenter's movies, Escape is really an outlier because it has a much more complex, gray take on the morality of its characters. When talking about his approach to horror, Carpenter said, "There are two different stories in horror, internal and external. In external horror films, the evil comes from the outside, the other tribe, this thing in the darkness that we don't understand. Internal is the human heart. You can see that in Halloween, The Fog, The Thing, Prince of Darkness, and so many more Carpenter stories. But Escape isn't a horror movie. It has touches of it for sure, but this is a blend of sci-fi thriller and classic western. The setting may use science fiction aesthetics in its dark future, but what is Snake if not the mysterious gunslinger come to town? And Snake is absolutely cast in the mold of the black hat anti-hero of spaghetti westerns like Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. Carpenter may have a lifelong love of the works of Howard Hawks, who made much more classic westerns, but Carpenter as a creator is much too cynical to embrace a story where the morally upright lawman saves the day and keeps the social order. America loves outlaws, said Carpenter. They've always loved outlaws. They always will. There's a soft spot in my heart for the bad guys. From start to finish, Carpenter makes sure to illustrate Snake as a bad guy, only focused on his own survival, willing to kill at any moment, and totally disinterested in the well-being of others. The film makes it clear that we're on the other side of World War III by the time the story starts, and Snake was a legendary war hero whose time in battle scarred him physically and left him cold to the rest of the world. Kurt Russell is just so perfect as Snake here, and when you watch it decades later, it seems like a natural fit. But at the time of the movie, it must have seemed like such a bizarre casting choice. Russell started as a child actor at the age of 12 and spent the majority of his early years in film working for Disney during a 10-year contract with the company. Most of the other films he made at Disney were pretty run-of-the-mill live-action stuff, but they really made Russell into a family-friendly star into his 20s. But Russell caught his big break thanks to one man, John Carpenter, who cast him as Elvis Presley in the TV movie Elvis, getting him an Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actor. Avco wanted Charles Bronson or Tommy Lee Jones, but Russell makes this movie. Still, Snake is such a huge shift for Russell that I think the closest comparison is Chris Pratt jumping from Parks and Rec's Andy to Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy. Keeping that in mind highlights the film's satirical side, with Russell specifically channeling Clint Eastwood for his character, saying, "I was trying to find Snake's voice before we were filming, and John said to me, 'We just got Lee Van Cleef to play Bob Hawke.' I thought, hey, since Clint Eastwood did all those films with him and made him a star, it could work for me. So I worked on Snake's version of Eastwood. He's quieter than Eastwood, sometimes so quiet you barely hear what he says. It's not just the, well, relatable things he says.
I don't give a fuck about your war. Or your president.
But the coldness he shows to anyone that he could possibly save that shows how Snake simply doesn't give a fuck about anyone. We both had a conversation at one time, I remember, about no man being an island, said Russell. We both vehemently disagree with that. We believe some men are islands. Some men prefer to be islands. I know a large part of John and I are like that. Snake Plissken is that island. And yet, by the end, Snake has found some little connection with his fellow fighters, only for their fates to harden him against the world even more. Outside of Snake, Escape is a murderer's row of fantastic character actors that make you just a little more excited when they show up in a movie. The intensely focused Lee Van Cleef as Police Commissioner Bob Hawke, adding a Western bona fide to the film. Ernest Borgnine as Cabby, who brings an off-kilter joy to this dangerous adventure. Donald Pleasance as President Harker, who relished in creating a president that could be taken down a peg. Isaac Hayes as the Duke, who's about as outlandishly cool as he is dangerous. Adrienne Barbeau as Maggie, who's sexy but also really committed to Snake and Brain's plan. Harry Dean Stanton as Brain, the genius of the island who can also never fully be trusted. Tom Atkins as Captain Ream, filling out the ranks and just being awesome like always. No movie that has Tom Atkins and Harry Dean Stanton can be bad. Now, you may already know this, but I love sci-fi. But saying you love sci-fi is just so broad because there's so many different types of science fiction. But what I really love is grimy sci-fi. RoboCop, Total Recall, Predator, Blade Runner, The Terminator. Less gleaming halls and beautiful interspace travel, more anti-heroes with crazy weapons lying in a gutter. I don't know, seems like my kind of people. Even when it comes to Star Wars, my favorite stuff has always been the bounty hunters and smugglers. Space scumbums. Hell yeah. And of course, that's exactly Escape from New York. There's really nothing all that sci-fi about Carpenter's movie. There's no laser swords or teleportation or alien invasion. The most sci-fi thing about the story is that it takes place in the future, and Manhattan is a prison instead of the government just making another privately funded one in the middle of nowhere to line investors' pockets and capitalize on recidivism that targets people of color who are forced into desperate situations by a country that abuses the lower class, instead of helping them with the hundreds of billions of dollars used on useless military funding and a refusal to tax billionaires taking advantage of bigger and bigger loopholes in our laws. But I digress. Think of Escape as the much more serious and low-key cousin to Carpenter's later film, Big Trouble in Little China. Escape is a satire. It's using this heightened premise of New York being turned into a prison by a totalitarian government to quell an out-of-control US, to dig more into issues of government oversight, crime rates worsening out of desperation, and the selfishness of politicians. You don't need to think about all those things to enjoy the film, but they're the larger purpose behind the action, suspense, and cool characters. It's the American dream revealed to be the American nightmare. Big Trouble is a parody. It's homaging Hong Kong action movies and westerns and making their tropes and choices so much bigger for the sake of comedy. There's not a larger societal target for the film, but instead it's lovingly poking fun of the tropes that power these films. Likewise, Russell is also channeling a famous western star in Big Trouble, John Wayne, going much bigger, broader, and funnier. And Big Trouble is probably my favorite Carpenter movie. Obviously, Russell and Carpenter got along swimmingly, and over the next decade they went on to make The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and Escape from LA together, and it really just seems like they're kindred spirits. You should definitely check out their commentaries and all the films they did for the DVD, Blu-ray, and Laserdisc releases over the last few years, because it is such a fun time, and it really gives you some good insight into not just the making of these movies, but their bond as creatives too. Escape doesn't spend too much time on satire, but it's there throughout because of the extremity of the situation. When Snake's being processed, intercom instructions reveal that prisoners can choose to self-terminate instead of entering the horrors that await in New York. The only representations of the government are in ruthless agents who see Snake as a tool to use, or the president, who we quickly see as a spineless, self-serving, arrogant piece of shit looking for leverage against other countries and not caring who dies in his service. That sounds familiar. Watching the movie today, you don't really think about how the film is casting the president in a really ignoble role. He is disrespected, scared, and shown to be an uncaring man. Pleasance himself wanted to wear a wig in one scene to make the character out to be a buffoon, but the studio was worried about making fun of the president. Of course, that's the point of how the character is used in Escape. In response, Carpenter made up an excuse. Relax, it's in the future. It'll be something that the audience will enjoy. Most of the film is really focused on survival and escape. The satire strengthens as the film ends because Snake's point of view and his attitude of fuck this, fuck the government, and fuck you too has shifted to become our own. I think one of the difficult aspects of Escape, but something that makes it special and much more different than what a modern approach to this story would be. Thank God the long-threatened remake directed by either Len Wiseman, Brett Ratner, or Breck Eisner will never happen, and I doubt that supposed sequel by Radio Silence is ever happening either, is that everyone in Escape is unlikable. This isn't a story about how, actually, the criminals in New York are unfairly imprisoned, or that the government agents are actually saving the country through their brutality. No, everyone in Manhattan is a dangerous killer and many are bordering on cartoonish monsters, while the government is filled with jackbooted thugs that disregard human lives. There are a few people you grow to care about, mostly because Borgnine, Stanton, and Barbeau are just so naturally likable, but that doesn't change their nature. The world is fucked. And that leads to the film's natural conclusion, with Snake choosing to swap and destroy the tape the president was meant to present to the world, and coolly walking off a free man. Is the world doomed, or is it just a nice middle finger to the United States? In either case, they deserve it. Escape leaves us with several lingering questions. What will happen to Snake and the world after the film ends? Just exactly who was Fresno Bob? And does Snake's Cobra tattoo wrap around his penis or cover it entirely? From my own personal experience, I would say that it, never mind. In any case, the fierce anarchic nature of this story can be read in many different interpretations. By the end of the 70s, there was a backlash against everything in the 60s, and that's what the 80s were. And Ronald Reagan became president, and Reaganomics came in, said Carpenter. A lot of the ideals that I grew up with were under assault. The film is a statement about how I feel that we must protect people's libertarian rights, said Hill. People themselves need to find the goodness in them, and I think it makes a political statement. One of the most fascinating aspects of Escape is that, despite its small production and modest box office, about $25 million domestically, its legacy and influence have been massive. I think that's largely due to how incredible Carpenter's concept and Kurt Russell's Snake Plissken are, and the result is a whole lot of both official and unofficial continuations and homages in the decades that followed. The biggest is obviously Escape from LA, Carpenter and Russell's sequel from 1996 that sees Snake this time sent into a Los Angeles that's been turned into an island from an earthquake and now used as a prison. LA is a real mixed bag. It's really just New York redone in a different setting with a bad script and some hilariously awful CGI, but it's a really pointed critique of US politicians using Christianity to persecute anyone they see as violating their code of morality. If it was better executed, I think its critiques, which feel much more accurate to modern America, would be heavily discussed in modern film analysis. But its underperformance at the box office, $42 million against a huge $50 million budget, stopped Carpenter's plans for Escape from Earth and really led to the wind down of his career. There was also an Escape from New York comic series in the late 2010s from Boom Studios, picking up right after the original and following an on-the-run Snake's battle to survive across this dystopian United States, eventually leading to a crossover with Big Trouble in Little China. Honestly, that's a whole lot more franchising than you'd ever expect from a film like this, but look outside of official continuations and the impact of the film really grows. Like a lot of the most influential sci-fi films from the 70s and 80s, Escape from New York created an easily replicable high concept that a lot of other low-budget studios could cash in on to make their own fast and cheap versions of this sci-fi future escape thriller. Escape from the Bronx, 2019, After the Fall of New York, Doomsday, the Escape copies have never really stopped because it's such a compelling idea. In particular, the Metal Gear Solid franchise owes a lot to Carpenter's movie. While my main man Hideo Kojima had already made 2 Metal Gear games, Snake's Revenge doesn't count, the original Metal Gear Solid from 1998 is what really turned the video game franchise into a classic. And the comparisons are really obvious, with the game seeing retired government agent Solid Snake brought in by the government to stop a rogue military unit that's taken over a secret government base to use its greatest weapon, with Snake a reluctant hero sneaking in and unknowingly injected with a virus. On the other hand is the sci-fi action movie Lockout from 2012, and starring Guy Pearce as ex-CIA agent turned convict Snow, sent to a space station prison to rescue the president's daughter. But the film is so clearly just Escape from New York in space, and really bad, that Carpenter would sue Besson and the other creators of Lockout in 2015 and pretty easily win, with Carpenter, Castle, and Studio Canal awarded $450,000. So why did Carpenter sue Besson and not Kojima? Well, according to the director, Studio Canal was more than willing to go after Kojima and the Metal Gear franchise, but was specifically stopped by John. I told them not to do that, said Carpenter. I know the director of those games, and he's a nice guy. Or at least, he's nice to me. Pretty based. Love you, John. It all speaks to what resonates at the core of Escape from New York. That the so-called American dream is just a step or two away from becoming a nightmare. Thanks for watching today's video, and I'm back talking about John Carpenter movies, and man, it feels so good to do that. It's been a while since I last talked about a Carpenter film officially, as last year I covered the Apocalypse trilogy during the Halloween season. But over time with my channel, I have covered a lot of Carpenter films, and Escape from New York is one that I've always wanted to check off that list. Years ago, before I started a YouTube channel, I had a blog, and I wrote plenty about Escape from New York, but it's been a long time and those blogs are probably totally lost to the internet now. So recently I had a real hunger to talk about a sci-fi movie, and when looking through my long list of topics that I wanted to cover someday, I realized that I still needed to talk about Escape from New York. And I really enjoyed going back and talking about it, both its details of the production and its overall commentary on the United States. Clearly, I have a lot of bones to pick, and I enjoyed doing it in a cathartic way with this video. I think that Escape from New York is very limited in its budget and its scope, and there's a lot of things about it that it could do just a little bit better if it had a little bit more money and time. But it's such a fascinating idea, and it's executed very stylishly, and it still feels pretty fresh after all these years, that I think it's great despite having its flaws be fairly obvious. And Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken is just so awesome. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Escape from New York and where you'd rank it among Carpenter's larger filmography, as well as what other Carpenter films you'd like for me to cover. I am starting to run out on topics, but I'm sure it won't be long until I'm talking about John once again. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron member, that would be pretty cool. It's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive monthly reviews for members only, with August's exclusive review being about Oldboy. The patrons and members are a bunch of dang-ass freaks. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and getting somebody to call you Snake.